Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time we're diving into how a leader's emotions can really impact their team's performance.
Oh, yeah.
We're basing this deep dive on some pretty interesting academic research that might just surprise you. I thought going into this that it was just going to be all about, leaders got to be positive, got to be happy all the time.
Right.
But it turns out it's not quite so simple, is it?
No,
Yeah.
it's not. It's so much more nuanced than that.
It's a lot more about
When those emotions come into play.
when those emotions come into play, yeah.
Yeah,
And to make things even more interesting, this study looked at thousands of consulting team members and hundreds of student athletes.
that's right.
So, we're talking some pretty significant data here, right?
What makes this research so compelling is that it challenges the common belief that leaders need to be constantly upbeat to achieve success.
Yeah,
The reality is far more intricate.
right.
It's not simply about what emotions are displayed, but also about the timing and sequence of those emotions.
Right. Yeah, that's what I found so intriguing. There's this idea of emotional imprinting.
Yes.
Basically, the emotions that a leader shows early on in a project or even just as a team is first forming can just have this huge ripple effect on, how everything that follows is perceived.
Think of it like this. Imagine you're laying the foundation for a skyscraper, right?
Okay.
Those early interactions, they create a blueprint that shapes how team members interpret every subsequent interaction. A leader who starts by projecting positivity cultivates a sense of respect and trust that becomes the bedrock of the team's dynamics.
It reminds me of Steve Jobs. We all know he had this reputation for being really demanding.
Right.
But the research points out that during the early stages of the iPhone development, he went all in on enthusiasm. He wasn't just talking about building a phone, like he was holding these product demos where his passion for creating a revolutionary and magical product was absolutely contagious. And you got to think that energy, that passion, it had to have some impact on the engineers.
That initial wave of positivity, that shared excitement, likely played a crucial role in establishing the tone for the entire project.
Yeah.
It's like a leader's early positive emotions
Yeah.
create a reservoir of goodwill that the team can draw upon later.
So, okay, we've got this, early positivity kind of setting the stage.
Yeah.
But then the research throws us a bit of a curveball.
Yes.
It suggests that a little bit of negative emotion sprinkled in a bit later on down the line can actually be a good thing. Now, I gotta say, that wasn't what I was expecting at all.
No, let me clarify. We're not advocating for negativity to become the norm. We're talking about carefully timed and infrequent displays of negative emotion, particularly after a leader has established that solid foundation of positivity.
So it's like once you've got that foundation of respect and trust in place, then a well-placed, touch of tough love can actually be a catalyst for growth.
Precisely. You can think of it as a strategic nudge, a way to re-energize and refocus the team. This idea is connected to another key finding. The researchers identified two primary pathways to high performance: the respect path and the status path.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me, I think. Can you break those down a bit?
Sure.
Like, what are those two paths?
Let's start with the respect path. It's pretty straightforward. When a leader consistently demonstrates respect for their team members, it creates a motivating force. People respond to feeling valued and appreciated. It strengthens their commitment and sense of ownership.
So a leader who genuinely respects their team inspires them to perform better.
Yes,
Yeah, that really resonates with me. What about the status path?
that's a fascinating one. The research shows that early displays of positive emotions from a leader can boost a team member's perceived status within the group. And you know what? That elevated sense of status often translates into improved performance. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people feel like they're valued and respected, they tend to rise to meet those expectations.
So it's almost like those early positive emotions are creating this kind of cycle of success. Like
Yeah.
the respect leads to an enhanced status, which in turn fuels even better performance.
Exactly. It's remarkable how these seemingly subtle emotional cues can have such a profound impact on both individual and team dynamics. And this connects to a concept the researchers call the impropriety threshold. Early expressions of positive emotions from a leader can actually make team members more receptive to constructive criticism later on.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying if you start off being positive, it actually makes it easier to deliver tough feedback later?
Yeah,
That's counterintuitive.
it is counterintuitive, but it's actually grounded in some fundamental principles of psychology. Early positive interactions build a reserve of goodwill, making later criticism less likely to be perceived as a personal attack. It's akin to the gain-loss theory, where we tend to value positive input from someone we already have a positive relationship with.
That makes sense. Yeah, a friend who's always super supportive,
Yeah.
offers me some constructive criticism, I'm much more likely to listen to it
Right.
because I know they have my best interests at heart.
That's the essence of it. That pre-existing foundation of trust and respect allows for honest and direct communication, which is essential for growth, both individually and as a team.
Now, I need some real-world examples here. Did the researchers provide any specific cases that actually demonstrate this emotional jolt in action?
They did. Remember our
Mm.
earlier conversation about Steve Jobs and the iPhone development?
Yeah.
Well, alongside that initial wave of enthusiasm, there were also moments where Jobs expressed his frustration. There's that famous anecdote about his resistance to the idea of a BlackBerry-style keyboard for the iPhone.
Right. Jobs was determined to have a sleek touchscreen interface.
Yeah,
I remember he famously said, "Your thumbs will learn."
exactly. While those expressions of frustration might have seemed harsh in the moment, they pushed the team to think differently, ultimately leading to a groundbreaking product.
So it's almost like those little jolts of negative emotion, particularly within an environment that's already positive and supportive, can actually spark innovation and drive teams to kind of, reach new heights.
Precisely. And this brings us to a crucial takeaway for all the leaders out there.
All right, lay some leadership wisdom on me.
Okay.
What's the key message here?
It's about recognizing that leadership is not about being a perpetual cheerleader. It's about mastering the art of emotional intelligence,
Mm.
reading the room, understanding your team's dynamics, and knowing when to amplify the positive vibes and when to strategically introduce a little bit of negativity to keep everyone moving forward.
So it's not about avoiding those negative emotions altogether. It's about using them strategically and sparingly,
Right.
particularly after you've already cultivated that culture of respect and trust.
Exactly. And that leads us to a question for you, our listener. Do you think this framework applies to other types of relationships? Think about teachers and students, parents and children, even mentors and mentees.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It makes you wonder if this whole concept of, emotional imprinting and strategically using negative emotions extends beyond just, the workplace. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Feel free to share your own experiences and insights with us.
While you ponder that, we're going to delve a little deeper into the research in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll be taking a close look at the two studies they conducted, one with those high-performing consulting teams and the other with student athletes.
Stick with us because we're about to get into the nitty-gritty details of this fascinating research. Welcome back to our deep dive into this fascinating world of how leader emotions can really make or break a team. One thing I really appreciate about this research is that they didn't just, theorize about this stuff. They actually went out and collected real data to back it all up.
Oh, absolutely. The researchers conducted two separate studies to explore these ideas, which really lends weight to their findings. The first one involved an enormous data set of nearly 10,000 consulting team members from a leading professional services firm.
10,000 team members. That's impressive. So what kind of information were they actually looking at within these consulting teams?
Well, they cleverly capitalized on the fact that this particular firm operates on a very structured trimester system. Each project has distinct early, middle, and late phases, which allowed them to analyze the written feedback that leaders gave to team members at the end of each phase. They were specifically looking for instances of positive and negative emotional expressions within that feedback.
So instead of focusing on the tasks and the deliverables and the performance reviews,
Right.
they were kind of digging into the emotional subtext.
Precisely. They were interested in those subtle emotional cues embedded within the feedback. And what they discovered was quite remarkable. Positive emotions expressed by leaders during the early phase of a project had a much stronger positive impact on team member performance than similar expressions later in the project.
Yeah, that just reinforces the idea of emotional imprinting that we were talking about before. It really seems like those initial impressions set the tone for, everything that follows. So did they find any evidence to support that emotional jolt idea in this first study?
They absolutely did. And this is where it gets really interesting. When leaders express negative emotions more frequently during the midpoint of a project, it actually led to a boost in performance. But here's the catch. This only held true if there was already a strong foundation of positive emotions established in the early phase.
Ah, so it's kind of like that early positivity provides a sort of safety net,
Right.
so that a little bit of constructive criticism a little bit later is seen as, motivation instead of something that's demoralizing.
That's a great way to put it. It acts like a reset button, prompting team members to reevaluate their performance and strive for improvement. It seems to be particularly effective when it comes to earning respect and status within the team.
So we've got this really, intriguing dynamic playing out in this fast-paced world of consulting. So what about the second study? Did they look at a totally different type of team?
They did.
Mm.
To see if their findings would generalize to a different context, they shifted their focus to student athletes across 20 NCAA Division I sports teams.
Now, that's an environment where I can really see all these emotional dynamics playing out. You've got the intensity of the competition, the coach-athlete relationship. It just seems like a perfect setting to really study these concepts.
You're right, it's a rich environment for observation. This time, instead of analyzing written feedback, they used surveys to capture both the emotions expressed by coaches and the athletes' perceptions of respect and status within their teams. They focused on two key periods, the preseason and the midpoint of the competitive season.
So they were able to directly assess, those two paths to performance, the respect and the status. What did they find?
Well, the results were remarkably consistent with the first study. Early positive emotions from coaches were a strong predictor of better performance later in the season. And again, respect played a key mediating role in this relationship.
So when athletes felt respected by their coaches early on, it had a direct positive impact on their performance down the road. That makes a lot of sense. Did they find any evidence for that emotional jolt idea in this athletic setting?
Yes, they did. Even in this high-pressure sports environment, they found support for that concept. More frequent expressions of negative emotions from coaches around the midpoint of the season were associated with better team performance. However, this pattern only held when those negative emotions were perceived through the lens of a strong foundation of early positivity.
So it seems like no matter what, whether it's a, high stakes business project or, a competitive sports season, it seems like those early leader emotions really lay the groundwork for success.
Absolutely. It underscores just how crucial it is for leaders to be mindful of their emotional expressions, particularly during those initial interactions. That foundation of positivity and respect is really the cornerstone.
Now, we've talked a lot about that respect path, but what about that status path? Did they find any support for that connection in this second study?
Interestingly, they did find a link between early positive emotions from coaches and athletes' perceived status within their teams. However, the relationship to performance wasn't as clear-cut as it was with respect.
That's curious. Why do you think that might be?
Well, one possible explanation is that in the context of sports, playing time is a major factor in determining status. And a lot of things can influence playing time, not just the coach's emotions. Talent, skill level, the team's strategic needs, these all play a role.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah. It adds another layer of complexity.
It does. But even though the link between early positive emotions, status, and performance wasn't as pronounced in this study, I think it's still a fertile area for future research.
Yeah, it definitely raises some interesting questions about, how those kind of subtle emotional cues can really impact team dynamics in different ways.
The researchers themselves acknowledge that there's still so much more we can learn about the complex interplay between leader emotions, timing, and team performance.
Yeah, there's always more to explore, isn't there? That's the beauty of research. It always leads to more questions.
It does. This particular study has certainly opened some exciting new pathways for future research.
So I'm eager to see what other insights emerge from this whole line of inquiry. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's just take a moment to recap what we've learned so far. What are some of the key takeaways that you'd like our listeners to remember?
Absolutely. So for all the leaders out there, here's the bottom line. Early positive emotions are absolutely essential. Focus on establishing a culture of respect and trust from the very beginning. Those early interactions are what shape how your team members will perceive everything that comes after.
And remember, don't be afraid to strategically incorporate a little bit of negativity later on, especially after you've built that foundation of positivity. Think of it as a way to challenge your team, help them refocus, and ultimately push them to achieve even greater things.
Precisely. And for all our listeners who aren't necessarily in leadership roles, take a moment to reflect on how this emotional imprinting framework might show up in other relationships in your life. Do those early impressions and the strategic use of negative emotions play a role in your interactions with friends, family members, or even mentors? It's a fascinating question to consider.
I love that. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to look at some of the limitations of this research and explore some of the intriguing questions it raises about future research. So stay tuned.
And we are back for the final part of our deep dive into leader emotions and team performance. We've uncovered some pretty fascinating insights so far, but you know, as with any research, I think it's important to acknowledge that no study is perfect.
Right.
Like every study is going to have its limitations. That's absolutely true. And the
Yeah.
researchers behind this study were very transparent about some of the limitations of their work, which I think is a sign of good science.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's always good to have a little healthy dose of skepticism, right?
Yeah.
So what were some of the caveats that they pointed out?
Well, one thing they highlighted was that in both of their studies, the performance data ultimately came from the leaders themselves.
Uh-huh.
Remember, in the consulting study, it was those performance reviews.
Right.
And in the athlete study, it was the coaches rating their players.
Okay, so there's potential for some bias creeping in there, like
Right.
maybe leaders who are naturally more positive in their communication style also tend to, you know, give more favorable performance ratings
Right.
regardless of like actual performance.
That's exactly the concern. In research, we call this common source bias, and it's something we always have to be aware of. Now, to their credit, the researchers did try to mitigate this potential bias by using different measures for emotions and performance. They also statistically controlled for past performance to try to isolate the impact of the leader's emotions.
So it sounds like they weren't, you know, totally oblivious to the issue.
Right.
They actually took some steps to address it, which is reassuring.
They did, but it's still a limitation worth noting. And it really highlights an important area for future research. It would be really valuable to explore ways to measure team performance more objectively, perhaps through data that isn't filtered through the leader's perceptions.
Yeah. It would be great to get, you know, some concrete objective data to really back up, you know, those more subjective ratings.
Absolutely. Another limitation they acknowledged was their focus on teams that have very clear temporal structures, like those consulting teams with their trimester system
Right.
and the athletes with their preseason and competitive season.
Right. Those teams have very defined phases and deadlines. So it makes you wonder if these same dynamics would actually play out in, you know, more fluid work environments where the boundaries aren't quite so rigid.
It's a valid question. It would be fascinating to see how these emotional patterns unfold in teams that have more flexibility and autonomy.
Hmm.
It's an open invitation for future research to really delve into that area.
We're already like generating new research questions. I love it.
Right.
That's what's so great about scientific inquiry, right?
I know.
It always leads to more questions.
It does. And there are so many other intriguing avenues to explore based on this study. For example, they focused on the overall frequency of positive and negative emotions. But what about the intensity of those
Oh,
emotions?
that's interesting. Yeah. So is it like, you know, a mild expression of frustration as effective as, let's say, a full-blown outburst?
Right.
Or could going overboard with the negativity actually backfire and damage that whole foundation of respect that we were talking about?
Exactly. There's a delicate balance to strike. And what about the specific types of negative emotions? Is anger more effective than sadness or anxiety when it comes to motivating performance? These are questions we just don't have answers to yet.
So many questions, so little time.
I
It
know.
feels like we've only just scratched the surface of understanding the complexities of all these emotional dynamics in teams.
We have, but that's what makes this field of research so exciting. There's a vast landscape of knowledge yet to be discovered.
Well, I know I'll be on the lookout for any future studies on this topic. It's just too fascinating to ignore. But before we wrap up for today, let's make sure our listeners leave with some really, you know, actionable insights. What are some of the key takeaways that you would like to emphasize?
Okay, so here's what I hope our listeners will remember. If you're in a leadership role, never underestimate the power of your emotions, especially in those early stages of a project or when a team is first forming. Prioritize building that positive foundation of respect and trust. And when you do need to inject a little bit of negative emotion, make sure it's strategic, it's infrequent, and always delivered within that context of overall positivity.
It's all about that balance. That's fantastic advice. And, you know, for everybody else out there, even if you're not in like, you know, a formal leadership position, take a moment to just think about how these emotional dynamics might be playing out in your own relationships. How do those early impressions, those strategic uses of negative emotions, when appropriate, shape the way you interact with friends, family members, or even mentors. I mean, it's something to really think about.
It is. And as always, we're eager to hear your thoughts and experiences. Feel free to reach out and share your insights with us.
Well, that is a wrap on another deep dive. We covered a lot of ground today, but I really hope that you've come away with some fresh new perspectives on the power of leader emotions. It's not just about, being positive all the time. It's about knowing when and how to use those emotions effectively.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those emotions in check, or at least strategically deployed.
That's right.